Grazie a tutti, benvenuti.
Thank you and welcome. Before anything else, let me say that we've had some problems with the people attending, because a lot of people hadn't been able to get here from Italy because of the problems at Zaventem after the terrorist attacks, and there are some technical problems which I'd like González to tell us about before we move into the debate.
All welcome and thanks for being here. We don't have problems and technical problems, but we rather have challenges. So we have two people live connecting through Zoom and Skype. So this will require a little bit of patience from all. They will be able to speak to us and to listen to us. We might have some issues with the interpretation coming from them, but we have done everything to make it possible. If that is not possible, then you would have the live sound and contributions from them. That's it, and later on they will be able to join us for the debate. By using your own mix, they will get the sound from you. Thank you.
Grazie, Sisa. Dunque, la ragione di questa iniziativa.
So the reason for this initiative and others which will follow it is that we want to think about how information and the freedom of the press is standing in Europe. I'll introduce the speakers very briefly. But before that, I want to say a couple of things myself. I think the impact that the end of the print press or its dramatic crisis is having on our view of democracy is being much underestimated.
Il ruolo che la
Because the role of freedom of the press in democracy, in Western democracy, in Europe, has always been very important. Historically, it's been exceptionally important. And the crisis in the daily press and changes in the media in general are things that we can't yet fully assess, but we certainly need already to be thinking about. None of us is able really to assess the impact of new technologies already and in the future on news. One thing that I, who've been a journalist all my life, am a bit worried about in the way that new technologies are being used is the general idea that it's easy now to get news and get informed. That's wrong, of course. These are both extremely complex operations and more complicated now than they used to be before the internet was invented, because the mass of false information that's actually propaganda or advertising, which is put about by the new technologies, is extremely high. So we kid ourselves that we're informed when actually we're getting much less information than we used to. And what's more, we kid ourselves that it's easy to get informed. It's easy to find out the truth of things. It's easy, we think, we tell ourselves, to get informed about what's going on around us. And none of those things is true at all. For one thing, because the profession of journalist, of the independent freelance journalist, is disappearing, and that's extremely bad for democracy. Freelance journalists have done a service to a journalism which is much in line with that of a free judiciary. At the moment, people working in journalism have working conditions which are infinitely more precarious and infinitely more and subject them to infinitely more conditions than was the case 10 years ago. So perhaps we should be thinking that independent news today needs to be provided in some other way. We should think of independent news as a common good, like other common goods, the cultural heritage, for example, or water or energy. So we should perhaps be thinking of a new way of getting information and a new relationship with sources of information. These are going to be problems that we have to live with over the next few years, because changes are coming very fast and are speeding up and are coming in an unpredictable way. And these are things we're going to talk about this afternoon in two panels. The first one with Giovanni Melogli, who's chairman of the European Media Initiative, and spokesman of the International Alliance of Journalists. We know him, he's been here to speak to us before, to talk precisely about development in the news. And there's Gerd Lerner, my fellow journalist, who wrote for La Repubblica in Italy, and then he's been on the television, and as well as continuing to be famous in the written press, and for books and the novels indeed. And then Panayotis Konstantinou, who's a Greek colleague. He comes from TVXS, which is an experimental station founded by Stelios Kouloglou, who is now a fellow member of the European Parliament in the GUI group. And it's a very interesting experiment in the sense that it's a public television station which is not public. In other words, it plays the role that used to be played by public broadcasters, by state broadcasters. And indeed on the role of state broadcasters, we should be starting up a debate here in the European Parliament, because this, in a sense, is a parallel process of destruction to the destruction of the traditional welfare state. There used to be a welfare state of information with the major publicly owned television chains, which have not been replaced, and there has not been any corresponding guarantee of freedom of information provided. So we'll start with Giovanni. Thank you, Kurzio, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the GUI for inviting me to speak and giving me the honor of opening this panel. Kurzio has already briefly listed the important things that we have to talk about in this situation. And what's peculiar about this is that it's not possible to forecast it. We're in a process of transition all the time. Some of the content which used to be mediated in the traditional media, the print and television that is, now comes from sources which are not easy to forecast. Now I've got a book here written in 1953 which says the following: in the 20th century, movement speeded up considerably. Articles got shorter, headlines as well. Everything was turned into sensationalist headlines and explosive headlines. And another page later, what you get is sort of jam-packed collections of headlines, but you can't be sure that they're correct. And then you get an idea of movement, of people packed in. That was written in 1951 by someone who obviously knew about audiovisual media and the power of the media and the power of the image and the power of film. He had a view of what television's power was going to be, but he clearly wasn't imagining what was going to be the power of the web and the potential of having the screen always with you in your pocket, the screen that gives you the impression of being informed. So I'll fall back on what Curzio said. It's a situation that's very difficult to predict, and the scenarios that face us are very difficult to read. But the trend seems to me to be clear. The figures for journalists are worrying, growing precariousness, growing diffusion. This is for Europe. Others can perhaps speak better than us of national cases. But if you're talking about Europe, there's one piece of information which sounds paradoxical, if you were rational, that is. In recent years, Europe has acquired a lot of powers and has therefore become a political subject. The European Union, that is, much more important than it used to be. Treaty of Lisbon, for example. So citizens ought to be better informed about what's going on in Europe. But in fact, in terms of journalism, in terms of news, there's less information about Europe in quantity terms, and fewer journalists accredited. In 2005, there were 1,300 journalists accredited here. Now there are about 900. And most of those have changed status. They're no longer special correspondents. They're not journalists, in other words, detached here by their own broadcaster or newspaper. They're people with a quite different sort of contractual relationship. They're essentially freelancers. And the way they work has changed. They've had to fit themselves out with television cameras, and they can't do the job that they used to do when their only activity and their priority was to write, was to provide news, in some cases for news agencies. Now they've had to produce under different criteria, and in particular nowadays they have to put video clips in, because the whole trend, as Curzio rightly said, is to move away from the written press and onto the web. And since the web is a different medium, it privileges audiovisual support, audiovisual content, at the expense of written content. And you can see this from in the different way that journalists now work, but there are other ways of showing it. If you look at France, newspaper kiosks are closing at the rate of 4 to 5% a year. So every year 1,000 newspaper kiosks are closing down. And that's been the case for 5 years or so, which is gives you a clear idea of how the written press is being abandoned in favor of the web. So the economic model, the traditional one, has collapsed, among other things because of the web, and it undermines, among other things, what used to be some fundamentals about the information business, the news business, such as news agencies, which have had to start to work in a different way and do business in a different way. Because newspapers, even local newspapers, don't have to subscribe to a wire service, because they can get all the information they need to produce their newspaper through the net, looking themselves, through using the permanent streams of news that are on the net. So the net is a challenge, which is one that the to face up. Of the journalists. So our experience in France for more than 10 years now, we've been doing a lot of projects on journalists' professional ethics, but what we've realized is that it's getting more and more difficult to reach journalists because they've got problems and they've got a lack of time to go any deeper into these issues and follow certain basic principles that ought to be in the foundations of their profession, because the new ways that news is produced force them to produce faster and produce more, in both cases at the cost of quality. So we've been forced, among other things, by the dramatic events, the terrorist attack, particularly on Charlie Hebdo, to change our projects in France and to talk instead about education in the media in order to make up for or find a way round the fact that I was talking about before, so that we can try to create a demand for quality news, quality information. And this might be a way to save the production of quality journalism, quality news, because the public might demand this if it's educated to demand it. Now, since we're in the European Parliament here, in the European Union context, I want to talk about what could be taken into account here at European level in this connection. First of all, what are the European Union's competencies to defend press freedom in Europe? This has been a debate for years. First case was an Italian one with Berlusconi, and then there was a Hungarian case, and now we've got Poland. And each time the European Commission's reply has been, we're sorry, but we don't have any powers, we can't intervene, because there isn't a clear legal right to freedom of information, which is wrong. Our citizens' initiative, therefore, urged the Commission to bring its own competencies to bear. We tried to get a million signatures on this petition, but and that would have been the start of the legislative process, but we didn't get enough signatures. And in parallel, there was a study from the International Media Defense Center showing that the power to defend freedom of information does exist, to defend it in member states does exist. So we're now pushing the European Parliament to push the Commission to admit this formally and develop the instruments that it needs to intervene in a member state that is clearly trampling on freedom of information. Another very important thing that has finally come out is a European media monitoring initiative. It started in 2007, then it worked in 2009, got stuck in the sand because a lot of member states weren't keen on it. But the monitoring arrangement is now up and running again. We've been testing it for 2 years, and now at last it's ready. And in 2016 we're going to be doing the first official formal monitoring of all member states of the Union in order to work out if there is a risk of a lack of pluralism in the media. And the first results should come out in October or November, and then we want the Commission to give us an official communication about what are the problems and how it could intervene where the risk was shown to be present. Another important thing is education, media education, of course. Personally, I think this is another field that we have to move in. As I said before, we have to try to support and encourage demand for quality in information. We want structured media education, starting in schools if possible. The European Commission has an education in media unit, which was set up in 2006, has developed its own monitoring to see what's being done in education in the different member states. So this is a moment of rebirth, and we must hope that their operations will be based on the fundamental concept that media education shouldn't be education in new digital media, but should be, on the contrary, a way to work out how to develop critical spirit in the face of sources and language in the media. So a way of getting citizens to inform themselves in a balanced, in a critical way, and above all a way of making citizens capable of reacting of their own accord to the information that reaches them. As Bradbury was saying in 1953, the problem is not so much having information, it's knowing how to assimilate information and react to it. So I think it's fundamental that we should aim at media education. And as well as the direct European Union competence, there can still be a stimulus to do that coming from the grassroots. Lastly, I think it's fundamental that public service broadcasting should be given a kick in the pants. It needs to be the fundamental instrument maintaining the level of information, level of news high, at a high quality. There are people saying that the market will help us, but the market is not going to save us. The market is not going to aim at quality news in order to satisfy the public's greed, the public's hunger. So it's not going to be the rules of the market that keep quality high. On the contrary, we need to create a different demand for quality that the market then has to fall in line with. So those are a few elements for dialogue. I hope that the future of news in Europe, news provision in Europe, is not going to go the same way as Bradbury predicted in his book in 1953.
Thank you, Giovanni. So many ideas, a wealth of useful comments. First of all, when it comes to the market excess, that's a problem because the market, in actual fact, allows us to be involved in independent journalism, but that's no longer the case. But the newspapers manage to hold their own on the market, but this generally held notion that the market can somehow provide free information. Well, that's a myth, and that can save the lives of people if we have more information. Well, why should news be free? And is there any way to support to the profession in a marketplace? I mean, it's always done that for 2 centuries, actually, in the form of newspapers with advertisers. Can we maintain the freedom of the editors, professional editors? How is it possible in this day and age to find other models that will work in a market of free journalism? I think these are ideas that GAD and others will have to deal with, whether it's on television or online. All of these markets.
Comincio dalla fine.
I'll start with the end. Since we find ourselves in a political forum, it occurs to me, in this meeting that's been organized by political groups from the left of the European spectrum, I think that it is inevitable that we start to address some issues, not as a public service, a public broadcasters broadcasting the news. We in Italy in particular have seen it ourselves, and as Corto Maltese says and others, we have to let the masks fall when it comes to this rhetoric of public service. We have the RAI, the public broadcaster in Italy. We don't have the legendary BBC that they have in the UK, and the mask of public service must fall, because what lies behind is rather more sordid when it comes to the carve-out of power and vested interests, and just an accumulation of different angles and framing of news. And this also involves the way the public broadcasters are financed, given away for free to journals, seen as instruments of cultural pluralism, but in actual fact what we've witnessed is a very low level of services of people below, well, just behind the scenes of the power. Given our history and our beliefs, it is rather, well, grudgingly, that I recognize that today I've come to the conclusion over time that we cannot have a supply from non-contaminated sources of information when it comes to the news. High-caliber journalism and cultural pluralism without this major issue being addressed in terms of the general finance. If we don't have any form of financing that is public financing of news, now, during most of my life, I was convinced of the opposite. As was pointed out, we were accustomed to telling ourselves that working in independent newspapers, you can be a counterpower, you can tell the other side of the story, you can speak on behalf, regardless of the general interests, and reach a healthy state of economic equilibrium. It's a matter of getting the mix right when it comes to the revenue from what you sell at the newsagents and the printed press, and also what revenue you get from advertising, provided that you don't get too much pressure brought to bear by the advertisers. But we thought that we could always find our area of freedom. And we could protect ourselves from the tainted editorialists, and we didn't really mind if the newspaper lost too much money, if it went into the red. Well, we thought you can make money selling cars or selling cement. Well, there are all kinds of different ways to make money, to do business. But the journal is just there for a lobby. In the same time, we wanted newspapers that would turn a profit. Now, those of us who were present on the 22nd of March that morning, we will have noted that at just past 9 o'clock, actually already as of 8 o'clock, all of the newspapers in the newsagents had become, well, just rubbish, worthless. Despite the excellent articles, the background information, useful insights, how many of you actually read those newspapers on the morning of the 22nd of March? These excellent newspapers that were produced the night before. Everything has changed. And that includes the way we establish relationships with the news, and the economic viability of those who produce the news. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, solemnly said that we need a new Facebook channel called Live Facebook, allowing for a number of options to go live sessions, allowing you to communicate between groups being created spontaneously. One of the two biggest Italian newspapers, La Repubblica, was very quick off the mark, with 2,600,000 friends, as they're called on Facebook, and immediately started with a whole series of live broadcasts with their correspondents, on the Italian scene and elsewhere. And today, not just with the actual printed version of 2,100, well, was there 2,600,000 friends on Facebook? Compare the figures. Saying that we are now directly in touch with the Italians, with this 250,000 followers in Italy. And the serious case of the torture and murder of an Italian student in Egypt got 200,000 followers, free followers. Nobody pays for that. And in so doing, they contribute to the financing of good news with a certain percentage, which is the margin is becoming narrower and narrower, inevitably bringing us into this logic of going private with private editorial policies, trying to reduce the increase in costs and to the greatest possible extent putting off the period when you start going into the red or you start losing money in the publishing houses in Italy. They are suffering losses or they're just very, very barely making ends meet. And we're seeing more and more concentration in journalism. Over the past months in Italy, we've seen two have seemed to more or less failed. The third, less known, is perhaps a better case. We had the publishing houses of books, Mondadori, the big Berlusconi family house, having bought the books of another big publishing house, Rizzoli, forced to sell it off in order to try to put a stop to the financial loss of the big newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, which is a public publishing house. More recently, two large groups, the ones responsible for La Repubblica, L'Espresso, and local newspapers in the Benedetti family, and they reached an agreement with the Agnelli Elkann family, another important capitalist family in Italy, of course involved in fiat, just to make that clear, trying to buy up the newspapers such as La Stampa and Il Secolo. Agnello Elkann now is part of the Espresso Group, exchanging their directors and journalists in order to reshape the editorial policy of these newspapers, coming into line, all falling into line and looking more and more like one another. What is the purpose? It's actually stated by the shareholders to put off the time when we start losing money. That time will come. Instead of 2 years, maybe they'll manage to spin it out into 4 or 5 years. But when the time comes, when they realize that they're running losses, I mean, it would be terrible if we had to sacrifice the quality of our newspapers and to pay even less for these new people hired, sending correspondents out to the world capitals. There won't be room for that. It won't be possible to address investigative journalism the way we used to, because we're accountable to our shareholders and to the budget constraints. In fact, in a more meaningful way, there have been some cases of news recently. People say, well, we've got online news, this new online journalism nowadays, and you don't need the printed press. In fact, for young people, the very idea of going to a newsagent to buy a piece of paper and to actually spend money to get news is totally beyond their comprehension. It would never occur to them. The digital information, they get their information, their news online. And the outsider groups of online journalism, Banzai, they produced a search engine and a number of online publications dealing with cooking, the economy, and general information. But they have just recently decided to sell their media department to Mondadori, the Berlusconi family involved in the publishing houses. Their newspapers without the paper. Some of them, the newspapers didn't have web presence. And not just in Italy, but worldwide. They hadn't yet found the way to find a sustainable presence to get the information online. Advertisement is increasing online, but it's a monopoly of Google and Facebook, a handful of multinationals. And they grab it all for themselves in a rather monopolistic way. And there is no such model, except for a number of very limited experiments, such as Mediapart in France. You have tens of thousands of people. What is it? Well, I thought it was a lower figure, actually, but you really don't see many people doing that. And the Banzai group, they saw their stock go down, and they thought that they could focus on e-commerce. A shareholder, a friend of mine, said, I'm passionate about journalism. I want to take risks to produce something nice, and I don't just want to sell refrigerators. Well, as frustrating as it is, we have to save the company. This is what is happening. Well, I've used up almost all of my time. To come back to my main thought that I started with, we need to change the yardsticks when it comes to how we spend public money on news. We can no longer use the yardstick that we used to use in Italy and that we suffered from so much. Each political party gets their share to sell their newspaper that allows them to have a number of officials on their behalf. And it didn't matter if they didn't sell as much. It is an unofficial way to finance your politics. We need to change that. The logical reasoning that was behind public financing of the radio and television broadcasters, the public broadcasters heading in the same direction. We need to start thinking that it is crucial when it comes to the common good, as Vinto Curzi said. And that is, after all, what news is. In the long run, we need a democratic media based on democratic principles. We need to establish the criteria for financing high-quality news. When it comes to getting training in local news and international news, enabling us to have the international correspondence, to travel, to have investigative journalists who can do their job, who sometimes taking months of work before any results can be seen, as we've seen now when it comes to the Panama tax haven or the Oscar Prize winner when it comes to the Boston pedophile scandal. All of that costs a great deal of money. And in the European Parliament, working with common parameters, there is a need to come up with new models for financing high-quality journalism and to train new generations in journalism. Otherwise, they will only have precarious jobs, insecure jobs that are servile towards infotainment because it's all free and nobody really cares.
Thank you, Gad. I think that is something that should be discussed here during the coming years. I wanted, prior to giving the floor to Panagiotis Konstantinou, to recall that, well, apart from any questions there may be from people present, there will also be questions coming in on Twitter. Now, one thing that struck me, an interesting point, related to young people, because, I mean, journalism has been a great job, a very exciting job for everyone present, and there are lots of young people who want to be journalists, young people who are very talented, but unfortunately they're no longer able to go into journalism, and I think what Panagiotis has got to say will be interesting from that point of view as well, because, well, Greece is having economic problems. Many possibilities have disappeared, but in spite of that, creative solutions have been found in order for independent journalism to continue to be practiced. So I look forward to hearing from him. Good afternoon. I think that our speakers very correctly raised the problems caused by the internet, misinformation, a lack of information, and we're getting to the point where information on Twitter is almost seen as the gospel. So there really has been a massive explosion of information on the internet, and I think that, to a certain extent, is a result of the corruption found in the traditional media, so to speak. I mean, I think that's the case in Greece as well. To understand the crisis that journalism is facing in Greece, you have to look at what in Greece is known as the triangle of catastrophe. I think that really plays a major role in the crisis we're seeing in journalism. I mean, it also plays a role in the economic crisis we're facing, of course. And the triangle is made up of the government, banks, and the owners of large media companies. I think you can see in all countries that there is connivance between the media and the government. It's not only in Greece that happens, but in Greece we have this particular situation, and let me explain it. You have high-level economic players that created a media system that was working at a loss. They basically funded it out of their own pockets without any banking guarantees or any concern about where the money was going, without any transparency, and they were encouraged to do this by the government as long as they supported the government. And you should be aware that the Greek media system owes banks over 800 million euros. I mean, I think that says a great deal about the situation in Greece at the moment. So you had this unholy alliance between the media and the government, and that's described in a document that was revealed by WikiLeaks. It was a document from the American Embassy in Athens that was sent to the Foreign Ministry in the United States. This is something that goes back to 2006, but actually nothing's changed since then. I mean, the situation has changed, but actually things have just got worse over the last 10 years. So, what did the document contain? Well, it stated that in Greece an information industry was set up, working at a loss, which functioned only to defend the positions of the government and the government's interests. The system works by highlighting the document highlights the relationship between the media and oligarchs. The document states that the media is owned by a small group of people who made their money in the banking, shipping, telecommunications, oil and insurance sectors and so on, and who have family links with members of the government and other politicians, as well as being linked to the business world and other people in the media. The document that was leaked names this media and political elite. I'm not going to mention the names now because I haven't got a great deal of time, but it's very easy to find the document on WikiLeaks and find the names out for yourself. So we're talking about media, television, channel owners who had close links with the government of the time. The text concludes by saying that these links between the media and the government in Greece are more complex and more incestuous than the links that existed between gods, demigods and humans in Greek mythology. And I think, well, we all know what happened to Greek mythology. It became Greek tragedy. So I think that's a good way of describing the situation. So that's the document. So in Greece, you have media businesses, or you had media businesses, whose goal wasn't to provide impartial information, but rather were at the services of certain political and economic interests. Then, of course, you had the crisis. Greece has a population of 100 million people, and it had, at the time, more newspapers than Germany and more sports newspapers than France. And all these publications were created to defend the interests of their owners and the government. Then, of course, the situation got even worse because we saw dozens of television channels appearing in a completely deregulated context. Private television stations in Greece have been working without any kind of license since the day they were set up. They have provisional licenses which aren't checked, and their capital structure isn't checked either. There's no control of that. The first tenders for the first 3 licenses were launched back in 1997. It was only in 2001 that applications were made from media owners. The tender process was then interrupted because, in spite of all the facilities that had been provided to media owners, they never provided information on where their funding came from, and neither did they provide any information on their shareholders. So I think that really brings us face to face with the Greek paradox once again. You have all these Greek media stations functioning illegally, and as a result of that, the tender process was stopped. Until the year 2009, these media companies were basically working as parasites. A lot of their income came from advertising, both private sector but also public sector. They received massive amounts of money to advertise for public sector monopolies, for example, the Greek electricity company, and that had nothing to do with ordinary advertising income at all. The owners of these media companies also got contracts from successive governments who they then supported via their media. These media owners also provided technical equipment for the public administration, for example. Now, following the economic crisis, their advertising income went down dramatically, as did contracts for public works. So 2 bubbles exploded at the same time. The Greek economy, the so-called casino economy, as it were, but these media companies' bubbles also burst because these parasite companies no longer had any resources left on which they could survive because the government tap had been switched off. So many newspapers shut down or started to be produced weekly or on a weekly or monthly basis rather than on a daily basis, and that meant that many journalists ended up unemployed or couldn't draw their salaries for significant periods of time. Those media outlets that did manage to survive clung on to the coattails of successive governments even more tenaciously, and that caused even more serious effects. The media needed to be kept alive as a result of the crisis, and so they were basically being given more and more loans that they absolutely couldn't pay back. To support the interests of the financial oligarchy and the governments, the media identified themselves with the Troika and the disastrous austerity program imposed on Greece. So they completely distorted reality and supported the austerity program. And I could show you videos and other programs from the last 5 years to demonstrate how they distorted reality and attacked all those who were against the policies they were in favour of. So, information coming from the traditional media in Greece has completely basically disappeared. There was no longer any information being provided. Everything was being utterly distorted before it reached the general public, and any dissenting opinion was simply swept aside. In 2014, Greece went down to 99th place in the Journalists Without Borders list of relative press freedom. 70% of the Greek population has no confidence in the traditional Greek media. And so that means that the media has lost its ability to influence Greek public opinion because the people no longer trust them. They've done everything they possibly can, or they did everything they possibly could to try and prevent Syriza coming to power. Obviously they failed, as we've seen. They also did their very best to influence the result of the referendum. I don't know whether you know what went on during that week when it comes to the press in Greece. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to everyone that really they were basically spreading misinformation. They were showing images of grandmothers sitting outside banks in Greece, and they were pretending that's the kind of thing that was going on in Greece. And this was all over the traditional media, these kinds of images. Now, when Syriza came to power, the government announced that it was going to try and restore some stability to the media sector. They decided to relaunch the tender process for operating licenses. They wanted to impose a certain level of transparency when it came to media funding. But obviously, when you try and influence or do something to this elite in Greece, well, obviously, then you have to face the attacks of the elite's media, and those are still ongoing today. It seems pretty clear that the media has lost a lot of its resources in Greece. They're no longer funded by the state. Certain levels of transparency are being asked of them. And all of that, of course, will mean that many media outlets will be obliged to close down. I mean, that doesn't mean the media are going to disappear. They may well change their names and more transparent procedures may be adopted. Now that was the majority of the private media sector in Greece, but the fact is that most of them actually are carrying on the same old dirty work to try and overturn the government. I mean, they want to bring back the previous government, which was favourable to them. So that sums up how the media have been working in Greece during recent years. And that's really what's triggered the birth of alternative media on the internet. In 2008, we created TVXS. That's the website I work for. That was the first information website that was set up in Greece. TVXS was set up by Stelios Koyoglu, who is with us here today. He was subject to censorship, and that's why he resigned from Greek public television, where he presented a weekly show that was extremely successful. The birth of TVXS coincided with the 2008 uprising in Greece and the murder of 2 policemen by the young Alexandros Grigoropoulos. You should be aware that this 2008 uprising was another reference point in the history of the Greek media. I mean, there was uproar among the traditional Greek media. Misinformation was being touted all over the place. They even doctored the video of the murder. They added sounds to make people believe that there was an uprising going on in the background, and to try and make people believe that the young man was killed by the police because there was a massive crowd chasing them. So that's what happened. So we developed this independent TV station. We developed an interactive relationship with our viewers, the people we provide information for, and the goal was to try and provide high quality reporting to react to the misinformation that was being distributed by the traditional press. Now we have around 1.5 million people who watch us between the ages of 15 and 25, and it's one of the most popular websites of the Greek internet network. In addition, the website is exclusively funded through advertising. What do we offer our readers? Well, we offer general coverage of the news, and we also provide specific information on art, technology, and history too. It's a reaction to the misinformation that ruled the roost in Greece until this point. All of this is anti-fascist and progressive, but we don't follow a party line. But our goal is to provide reliable, verified information. A constant flow of it. So you can get the main news stories of the day on the website at the top of the page, and then there are particular sections that follow different issues, and then you've got an events section at the bottom of the page. So it really is a website that provides a full range of information. The work of our website is based on editorial independence and the collective management of the website. I've mentioned the news. We also provide high quality information in fields such as science, the environment and history. These are sections that we set up right at the start. It's well known that those who don't know their past have no future. So it's a very well set out website. We have articles on people who have influenced history. We've also set up a historical archive that has no equivalent anywhere else in Greece. There's also a page given over to solidarity movements. New Greece that launches new ideas. That's the heading that we call Good News, and we hope that this heading will broadcast alternative ideas that are being broadcast in our country. Thank you.
Grazie. Dunque noi abbiamo
We've got a few minutes left before we connect with Julian Assange. That'll be very interesting, I think, and Miguel Urban of Podemos will be leading that section. There's some members of Parliament have come here. So what I'd like to know is whether the questions Takis Georgiou and Barbara Spinelli have come here. She's also, of course, a very remarkable journalist as well as a member of Parliament. And there might be questions from the public as well. But let's try and make it very quick, because I think we all want to know what Assange has to say about all this.
Grazie, Curzio.
Thank you, Curzio. Thank you for this splendid opportunity to talk about information and counter-information, disinformation. I want to say something about the incestuous relationship between politicians and the media. I wouldn't like to compare them with relations between gods or demigods, because now we know that catastrophe doesn't produce tragedy. The tragedy was newspapers and the conflict within the polis. The thing that most struck me on the 22nd of March, and even before that in Paris, when there were the attacks there, is that there's a black hole on what's going on in our cities. Nobody knew anything from the various journalistic investigations about Molenbeek. We discovered the place on the 22nd of March, and yet it's an important neighborhood in terms of radicalization, and has been since 2001, when the terrorists left who killed Massoud in Afghanistan. So investigations could have been done ages ago. Same thing applies to France. And all this increases the number of commonplaces about violent radicalization. People say it's the French banlieue. No, radicalization isn't happening in places like that, mainly. It isn't happening mainly in the banlieue. It's happening among the middle class and very solitary people, lonely people. The middle classes, which of course are particularly affected by this divide and rule policy that is austerity. So the thing that strikes me is a question I want to ask all of you about Gad Lerner's suggestion of a public aid for news provision. I'm right in favor of this myself. I'd like to remind you what basically the Roosevelt plan was. Since we're now facing a similar sort of crisis to the one in the 30s, what Roosevelt's job was, let's find out about America, the America that we don't know. And I think we now need a similar project to discover our own towns and neighborhoods. We haven't got a problem with any shortage of journalists in war zones or journalists here at home, but we need public help for this, and also for alternative sites. I have an idea of survival of journalism where alternative sites, jointly with NGOs, manage to put over the counter news, the counter information about this crisis, the good news from the Greek site, for example. That's what we've been missing. The good news, the alternative reactions, the counter-arguments to the dominant xenophobic discourse. And thank you very much, Curzio, for the initiative.
Questa è una cosa, posso dire, un minuto molto interessante.
That's very interesting, and it's interesting for everybody, I think. When you're talking about major European operations of the sort we were talking about in Italy, it would be interesting to know what alternatives there are to those. And it would be very interesting to know, over and above the scandals and little scandals tied to oil everywhere, not just in Italy, what Europe's energy policy is, if there still is one after Paris, if there's really a desire to change project. So all of these suggestions that Barbara was making are things that the free press has been doing, jobs that they've been doing for years, but they're not able to do any more.
Qualcuno che vuole intervenire?
Does anybody want to speak, ask questions? Stelios.
Λοιπόν, για την πρόταση που ακούστηκε και από τον Gad Lerner και από την...
As regards Gad Lerner's suggestion and Barbara's, I've been thinking of something like that myself for a long time. I think we on the left should be proposing in Parliament a system of financing the media across Europe. But I'm afraid it's going to be very difficult to arrange this, because the dominant position here is privatize everything. Privatize our children if they could. They're ready to privatize everything, including their own children. And in this neoliberal climate, it's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to put over a proposal to subsidize the public sector. Then there's another thing. You could have a policy of controlling the media, monitoring the media. But nobody's planning to finance a media group with a more independent editorial line. There's now a world policy of limiting press freedom and democratic rights, which has been imposed everywhere. And that's getting stronger every time there's a terrorist attack. So the very bold kind of initiative that happened after the Second Cold War are going to be difficult now. At that time, the political leaders who had known the war decided to finance the independent press. They decided that in France, for example. Le Monde was encouraged by General de Gaulle. In order that there should be an independent press expressing itself, but you wouldn't be able to do that now. In the United States, after the 11th of September, it wasn't possible either. One of our political advisors here in the GUI a few days ago was unable to go to the United States or even to Canada because he wouldn't have been able to get to Canada without overflying the United States. Actually, that wasn't going to happen, but he was prevented from getting onto that plane. Now, I founded this site that you've heard about because I was sacked by public television, but a month before I was sacked, the managing board of ERT, the public television service in Greece, met. I had a program there, and according to the minutes subsequently published of that board meeting, it was said that this program and this guy, in other words me, were creating problems in the relationship between Greece and the United States. And they kept getting protests from the State Department and the American administration. A month afterwards, I was sacked. What I mean by that is that these are not very propitious conditions at the moment, as they, on the contrary, they were at the end of the war. There you could hope that things were going to change for the better. It would be nice if there were enlightened people in Europe who were prepared to finance independent media, but I can't see anybody doing it. Mrs. Merkel? Or Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary? Mr. Renzi, President Hollande? I doubt it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have very little time because, of course, Giovanni wants to come in on what Barbara had to say. I don't think we can keep our connection with Julian Assange waiting much longer. So, Miguel, just 1 minute of your time for 2 practical points following what Barbara said. What I tried to quickly cover in my statement initially is the possibility, by changing the audiovisual public services text in the Parliament, calling upon the Commission to have a binding authority for the media that is independent of each member state. That would be the only truly binding instrument to have this unique competence in Europe of overcoming the audiovisual policies in each member state, coordinating by independent authorities, demonstrating that they are independent in Europe. The Parliament could then produce legislation together with the Council. We hope that that will be acted upon to try to impose that. The second thing, specifically, when it comes to Gad Lerner's proposal, at the EU level, I think it is possible, of course, to have direct co-funding of the independent editorial policies. But if we have this Parliament and Commission policy in the various research, such as the Horizon 2020 projects, you could include such projects, developing new models for potential sustainable economic models for the media. We could conduct research on the possibility of having the criteria for financing independent media. That's something that we can do, or through pilot projects in the European Parliament. Thank you. Thank you. I must apologize to Takis and David and others who wanted to come in. There will be the second part of the panel with Stelis, and there will be more time perhaps for questions. And Michael Urbano, would you step up here?
Muchas gracias por cedernos.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make a few comments and to introduce Julian. I think this kind of event in the European Parliament is very important. Pascual Serrano said that one of the problems with journalism is how easy it is for the media to basically transmit the official versions of what goes on. I mean, I think we've all seen this in the media, but I mean, rather than journalism, it's basically advertising, isn't it? An Italian colleague, director of Telecinco, said that very thing. I mean, we base ourselves on the idea that information is a public good, and it's something that political representatives should guarantee. Unfortunately, the general public is used to information being manipulated for the benefits of the governing party or in the interests of those who own the media, paradoxically. In Spain, we also have a paradox, because it's one of the European countries in which access to information is legislatively the best protected. I mean, it's even in our constitution where it states that the right to receive accurate information is a fundamental right. Given that, it's interesting that Spain isn't the country in Europe where we have the best and most accurate information. Public legislation in Spain is underdeveloped. That may be one reason. Another reason may be because public sector media has not been developed as it should have been. Or another reason could be because of the oligopoly that owns the media. We basically have two media conglomerates that exchange various media channels, etc., between themselves, and they basically are concerned with the shareholders that fund them. And here we're talking about large-scale businesses, members of the Spanish aristocracy, banks, even the church, which spends a significant amount of the money that it receives from the public purse in paying for the media in our country. For us in Podemos, it's crucial to establish a movement in which political and social organisations are involved, as well as alternative journalists and media, and the idea being to defend the idea of information as a public good. One of the key points in our electoral manifesto was that we needed to legislate to promote the open, transparent and public control of at least some of the Spanish media, guaranteeing, of course, that the media would be independent of the governing party and also independent of the large business groups in the country. They can't be too close to forming public opinion. Another key element that I wanted to highlight was that for us it's necessary to guarantee the freedom of expression of those who generate information at all costs, whether we're talking about journalists or whistleblowers. We've all seen what happened with the Panama Papers, and I think that really shows how important what we're trying to do is. I mean, these kinds of people are under constant pressure and threats from established powers to try and get them to hide threats to the established order. We have a right to know what businesses and governments do. We also have a right to know exactly why things are done. And I think this is really a good point to introduce, to bring in the name Julian Assange. I mean, I don't think I need to introduce him. He needs no introduction. But what I would like to do is take this opportunity to send him the best wishes and support of many, many people. So this is support for him and to all the others, people like him, who make things like Wikipedia and other forms of independent media possible. Welcome, Julian. You have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Brussels?
Yes,
your thumb.
yes.
We hear you.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'd like to thank you for putting together this panel. It's a very important subject. In fact, I think for humanity, it is the most important subject. Because as human beings, we differentiate ourselves from other animals by our ability to learn from each other and learn from our mistakes. And we do that properly by communicating with each other what we've found about the world in short periods of time and in long periods of time, within one culture and within one nation and across cultures and across nations. And the more that we are able to do that, the more that we are able to understand our political and geographical environment and adapt accordingly. And if you think about it, let's push things to extremes. Let's imagine that nobody could communicate whatsoever, that every person was deaf and mute. What would happen? Well, society would fall apart. There would be mass starvation. Everyone would repeat every mistake possible. No one could learn from anyone else, except by seeing them fail directly with their own eyes. And so the question becomes, where are we now as a civilization? Are we where we could be in terms of learning from each other and our historical record? Are our political systems as advanced as they could possibly be, as humane as they could possibly be, reducing conflict as much as they possibly can? Well, I think the answer is obvious, that why we are not individual trees deaf and mute in the forest or stones thrown onto the shore, unable to learn and unable to communicate, neither are we at the point where we can truly understand what it is we are collectively going through. Why is that? Well, as time has gone by, we have advanced in our technological ability to communicate. But there's more factors than just purely technical factors. There's people's ability to manipulate and control communications, to monopolize communications, to divert the true experience that people have observed about how their society works, and instead adjust it for their own interests. And this, broadly speaking, is the traditional problem with the establishment press. And the new political vibrancy that we're seeing in the United States, that we've seen in Spain with the rise of Podemos, that we've seen in Greece with Syriza, that we've seen also in many different ways with the rise of nationalist parties throughout Europe. This is coming about precisely because the communications revolution of the internet is breaking down the traditional gatekeeping function of the establishment press. It is describing more about how society actually works, who its players are, and allowing new ideas to come out. Now, I don't think, however, we should be praising the situation too much. It is getting better, but it is still very, very bad indeed. And there are certain tendencies to suggest it may become even worse. while there are profusion of new publishers and new audiences because of the decreasing cost of becoming a publisher and the increasing ability for one publisher to communicate to an audience that is not immediately physically proximate to it. The ability for publishers to publish internationally and in other regions within the same language group. That same connecting together all the different parts of society globally through the internet is permitting giant monopolies to start to form. The convergence of existing oligarch-run press and the construction of new mega publishing groups like Google, which now controls something like 80% of the internet advertising market, but is taking over the role of many publishers or merging with publishers, becoming a content provider, a distribution provider, a search provider, an email provider, a mobile phone provider, and so on. And so, on the one hand, we have moved a long way away from the town with one or two newspapers, an oligarchical state-owned TV, but we are also moving to an uncertain future. Whether there will be, as there is in other markets, the eventual domination of one or two major players, and then everyone else being peripheral, as there's consolidation amongst the different players, achieving economies of scale by integrating with each other. Okay, so that's the challenge that we face globally. The internet is causing a profusion of new publishers, which is producing a new political vibrancy. But will that new political vibrancy be gobbled up as a result of increasing monopolization and consolidation of these new publishers into more efficient forms, the efficiency coming about through economies of scale, where the largest groups merge in one way or another with each other. The second challenge, and it's a challenge that the media has always faced, is about funding. In architecture, we say that form follows function, but the reality for the media is that form follows funding. And most media players are caught between two imperatives. On the one hand, to have an audience to influence, and on the other hand, the constraints of their funders. It is very rare that the audience is the funder. WikiLeaks is an exception to that rule. We are completely reader funded. Other organizations are funded by the state, by oligarchs with other industrial concerns, by billionaire foundations working to achieve political agendas by proxy. And you can speak about the traditional US foundations, such as Soros, or the Rockefeller Foundation or Ford Foundation, or its government equivalents, such as USAID. And that creates a limiter on how truly a media organization can report what it understands about the world to the audience that demands that understanding. Now, that problem is becoming worse. There's the amount of reader funding is decreasing, and a third funding source, which has been advertisers, is also decreasing. But there's a counterweight to this process. It's an interesting question as to whether the counterweight is enough, and that counterweight is the ability for publishers, despite the corruption that's involved or the limitations that's involved in their funding, to communicate to audiences that are out of jurisdiction or out of their local captured industrial niche. Now that's happening with state players. For example, yes, for a long time, the US Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is the formal US state propaganda office, has been broadcasting content into the former Soviet states, Radio Free Asia, and so on, pushing, undermining political organizations and others that the US considers to be its opponents, and propping up others that the US considers to be acting in its favor. But BBC is doing the same thing. Deutsche Welle, to a lesser degree, is pushing German perspectives across the world. RT and a lot of new Russian state-funded outfits are pushing, yes, in some sense, Russian propaganda, but in another sense, Russian perspectives and Russian attempts to undermine narratives that have been constructed out of Washington, D.C. The same thing is happening with oligarch-funded media organizations or foundation-funded organizations. So this clash and profusion of voices is doing something very important, even though those funding models are very limiting individually and corrupting individually. Across the spectrum, they're doing something good. Now, if we're to talk about what the situation is for Europe and what Europe can do, well, the European institution is facing a crisis of political legitimacy. It has that crisis of political legitimacy because it is not able to respond dynamically to the concerns of Europeans to regain its political legitimacy. Now, part of the way of regaining its political legitimacy would be to create an environment that Europeans can believe in, an environment that has freedom of speech for Europeans as a central virtue in the European project, an environment which limits the ability of organizations such as Google to dominate the European media landscape, that keeps a sense of fresh European political ideas at the European level and at the national level for organizations within Europe. And finally, WikiLeaks has specialized in protecting whistleblowers and protecting free speech rights, not simply by litigating about it, not simply by talking about abuses, but by enforcing it by practice, enforcing by doing. And the reality is no nation state, no establishment will defend its own critics, speaking at a sufficiently high volume. That is simply the reality of the structure of nation states, that they are comprised of various power groups, from the military to industrial concerns to political and media classes. No nation state is probably capable of enforcing its laws in relation to freedom of speech, and that includes nation states within Europe. However, the slack can be taken up. It can be taken up by other states within Europe, and it can be taken up by European institutions when there is an excess of censorship or the demonization or the persecution of a whistleblower or publisher within one state in Europe. A political relief valve can be constructed by giving those people asylum in other states in Europe, giving them access to institutions like the ECHR, which is run by the Council of Europe, and by constructing European laws that can be act as guidance and in some cases be enforced in one state or another to reduce the excess retribution of its establishment classes in response to publication. Now that I think is an important project for the European Parliament, an important project for Europe to regain its sense of political legitimacy. And it's something that many publishers, these vibrant new publishers that are arising because of the internet, will support, and in doing so, they will more broadly support a renewal of the European parliamentary project.
Muchas gracias, Julian. Ahora...
Thank you, Julian. Let me now give the floor to my colleague Stelios. And let me thank Julian and everyone else for being here.
Thanks, Miguel. Julian, will you stay with us up to the end of the transmission? Because there are questions, I guess. Is Julian online still?
Yes, I will. I will stay for 20
All
minutes,
right.
the first 20 minutes of the question.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, we'll go to the second panel, and I have Ignacio Escolar, Kostas Arvanitis from Greece, and Mrs. Sezin Oney from Turkey. Well, Ignacio Escolar is the founder and editor of El Diario España. Is a very well-known information site in Spain. He was also founder of different publications like the Público in 2007, and he's a political analyst and columnist. He's also the author of EscolarNet, the most popular and widely read political blog in Spain, and been awarded different prizes as best political and journalism blog. So please, and what is the? Oh, okay. So Ignacio, you have the floor, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Please, quiet, please. Ησυχία, παρακαλώ.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for all the comments that have been made previously. I was listening very carefully to what was said previously, and a lot of the things that have been said about what's going on in Italy and Greece aren't that dissimilar to what's going on in Spain. In Spain, the press, like as is the case for all the press, particularly in the south of Europe, has gone through a dual crisis, a technological crisis with the arrival of the internet, and an economic crisis that was twofold in the south of Europe, caused by the debt crisis. You all know enough about that, and that's not today's subject. But just to give you some subjects, between 2008 and 2015, around 12,000 journalists lost their jobs, according to the Madrid Press Association's figures. And that's around a third of Spanish journalists who were at work in the year 2008 and who are no longer working now. The toughest time was 2013-2014. Since 2014-2015, the figures for journalist employment have improved, but they're far from having reached the previous highs. During that time, 2008 to 2015, income for the media has gone down by almost a third. The sales of newspapers have gone down from 4 million to 2.4 million. And like in all countries, the crisis has caused problems with regard to editorial independence in many newspapers and media groups. I mean, the fact is that if a newspaper is losing money day after day, but it keeps coming out, well, it's because someone's paying for it to come out, and it's not readers who pay for it. It's usually the backer, whoever that is. And it's because they're interested in the information that the newspaper provides and the fact that it can influence public opinion. In addition, in Spain, like for almost all other businesses, debts were very high for Spanish newspapers, interest rates were low, it was very easy for them to get credit. But then when the easy credit conditions became more difficult, then the financial sector basically took possession of the media, and they are by far the largest shareholders in Spanish media. They've converted media debt into shares which they hold in media companies. As everyone knows, Spain has been through a bailout program, and that has meant that there have been press conferences, for example, which journalists have struggled to get into. I mean, there are always journalists in all media groups trying to do their best, but the conditions for being able to provide independent information on many issues are worse now than they were 6, 7 or 8 years ago. So that's the situation. And then in 2012, perhaps at the worst possible time, we founded Diario.es. We started off as a very small newspaper indeed. There were just 2 people on the editorial team. We're shareholders in the business as well. And in less than 4 years, we have become the second most read digital newspaper in Spain, and one of the 7 most read newspapers in Spain. We have 6 million readers, and we've had to move 4 times. We've now reached our current offices. 60 of us are working in Madrid, and there are 40 journalists working in our local editorial teams, and we're present in almost all the autonomous communities, Andalusia, the Basque Country, Catalonia, the Canary Islands, Asturias, and so on. Now, when we set this up, we did it following the closure of the newspaper that I used to work in, which was the Diario Público. And I was a director, and one of the first things I learned as a director was that it's not the director that runs the place, it's the owner. And so when that closed down, then we decided that would never happen again. We never wanted to be owned by someone else. We wanted to be in charge of editing in our own newspaper. And that wasn't because we wanted to be businessmen. We weren't particularly ambitious in that context. It was just that we believed that would be the best and the most professional way for us to provide independent information. As owners, it meant that we could comply with the social purpose that we believe the media has. I mean, we're not just any old business. Well, it is in a way, to the extent that we're aware that if we're not economically independent, we can't be editorially independent. We're very careful with our income, with our expenditure, the way we fund ourselves. But it's not in terms of its social function. I mean, we're not manufacturing screws. We're providing information. I think there's a direct link between the quality of the information that appears in a country and the quality of its democracy. So when we launched Diario.es, we really paid a lot of attention to the economic model that we were going to use, and things have gone pretty well. We're making a profit. We're one of the few media forms in Spain that is in that situation. We don't owe anything to any bank. We've made profits now for 3 years in a row. They're very small profits. That's not our purpose. We're not there to make profit. But so what we do is when we have profits, we reinvest them in our newspaper. As I said, we started off with 2 people. Now we have 60. We pay out around 600,000 euros a year, roughly. The newspaper now costs us 1.3 million euros a year. And basically, we fund this via our readers. You can read eldiario.es without paying. You can log on to, or you can go on our website and read our news stories free of charge. We didn't want to make people pay. We wanted information to circulate freely. I mean, you had 25% unemployment rate in Spain, apart from anything else, so we couldn't. Restrict information to those who could afford to pay. But what we did decide to do, though, is give people the option to pay. And once people subscribe, then they get a preview of the news that's going to come out the next day every evening. And you can only get that preview if you're a subscriber. Also, we give our subscribers advert-free access. We also provide a paper version 3 times a year. I mean, we don't publish our newspaper on a daily basis on paper, because there's not really a lot of point nowadays in producing paper copies. But we do produce a magazine 3 times a year with more in-depth articles on topical issues that have been discussed in the media for months or years. The latest one was on Catalonian independence. And subscribers don't necessarily pay for those advantages, the preview, advert-free access or whatever. It's because they agree with us that if you're not a customer, you are the good. I mean, if you don't pay for the news, then the news site's going to get its funding from elsewhere rather than its readers, and they may well have different interests. We now have 550 subscribers. They pay a certain amount of money a year, and that basically funds most of our expenditure. The rest of it's funded via advertising. But the advantage that we have is that no single advertiser provides a significant portion of our income. So our number one customer is our readers. It's not any business or institution. We're also very focused on equality. We practice it at our newspaper. We have a ratio of 3 to 1 if you compare the highest salaries and the lowest salaries. We have been putting up increasing salaries over the years, but we maintain that ratio. I get paid the most as director, but it's only 3 times what the lowest paid person is. And the idea is to establish an economic model that can ensure that independent journalism can survive. We specialize in exclusive on politics and corruption. We've highlighted cases of corruption in the institutions. For example, Bankia Caja Madrid affair. Bankia was the banking entity that caused the bailout in Spain, and we looked into the emails of its previous president, and we found out that this bank, which was partially publicly owned by political parties, etc., and there were so-called opaque credit cards that could spend money without explaining anything to anyone, even the taxman. So we discovered the existence of these credit cards. We published articles on it. There was an internal audit carried out within the bank. They discovered the problems, and now there is a legal case going on in which many people are involved, including Rodrigo Rato, the former president of the IMF. And all of this was triggered by the information that we published in eldiario.es. Every time we publish this kind of information, there are many more readers who want to subscribe to our newspaper so they can support us in carrying on this kind of investigative journalism. And just a few weeks ago, we published mobile phone messages between members of the royal family and those who were involved in the illegal credit cards affair. They were friends of the royal family, and we published the fact that money had been unduly spent on these credit cards, and that there was a contact with the royal family there. So we get involved in all these sensitive issues, but we report them independently, and that's a result of our economic model. The previous speakers mentioned the role that the state needs to play when it comes to the media. What commitment should they have to maintaining media pluralism, press independence, etc.? Well, in our case, the right to information is in our constitution, as Miguel Urban said. And I share all those ideas, but I think in Spain's case, it would be enough for me if there was no discrimination against us as independent media. In many countries in which there is more awareness of media freedom and the importance of media independence, things are different. I mean, in Spain, things are very opaque and arbitrary. The government has become one of the #1 advertisers in the media as a result of the crisis, and here I'm talking about the national government, the various regional and local governments as well. They invest millions of euros in advertising, and they distribute their adverts in an opaque and arbitrary manner. Sometimes we discover how public sector advertising has been distributed. For example, when it came to Madrid Council, we published that recently, and we found that the media that had benefited were the media that were close to the party that was governing Madrid City Council at the time. I mean, that's not the only case, of course, but that was one case that we highlighted in our news. And basically, that means that independent media are directly damaged by what public sector administrations are doing, because when elected representatives are favouring media that support them, well, they're manipulating information. I mean, they're ensuring that competition isn't on a level playing field because some media groups have more money than others and can fund their losses using public money, as long as they publish information that is biased towards the party in government. We're also discriminated against when it comes to the tax regime. We pay a different VAT rate. The internet media pays a different VAT rate than printed media. I mean, I think everyone has an interest in there being a level playing field, and what I don't understand is why there should be a difference between media groups that chop down trees in Canada and those that don't. The fact is that nowadays you have more and more people who read the news online. I mean, even those who get a paper edition of a newspaper often read it online, and yet there is still discrimination against internet media. And then you also have discrimination when it comes to the attribution of funds to media groups. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I must remind you that this meeting is transmitted via different sides, including the official side of the GUE, of the European left. It's also transmitted in different Greek sites, including TVXS, as well as the radio, a network of Greek radios in Athens, where our next speaker is director. His name is Kostas Arvanitis. He's a well-known journalist with a long experience in Greece as a reporter and presenter for the radio and the television. He has been kicked off of the television during the previous government, and since 2013 he is a director of a radio, Stokokino. It's a radio that belongs to the political party, to Syriza. But then Kostas managed to organize a network of local stations, not necessarily belonging to the Syriza party, but as a network. Now he has another proposition to organize a European network of alternative news. So I'm giving him the speech. But in the meantime, you can ask the previous speakers, including all the previous speakers, including Julian Assange. You can ask through the Twitter, hashtag alternative media. The answers will be given after the end of the speeches here. So it's hashtag alternative media for your questions. There are people here that are going to collect the questions that will be answered later. Now Kostas has the speech, has the floor through Skype, via Skype. Kostas.
Καλησπέρα από την Αθήνα. Καταρχήν από το Σούνιο, για να είμαι πιο ακριβής. Είμαι πολύ στεναχωρημένος που δεν τα κατάφερα να...
Hello from Athens.
Και να σας παρουσιάσω καταρχήν...
Sorry, the sound quality is not good enough.
...που αφορούν τη δική μας δράση εδώ. Και να σας πω ότι το ραδιόφωνο λέγεται στο κόκκινο, Red Radio δηλαδή, και ο ήχος μας, το σήμα το διακριτικό μας, είναι αυτό. Έχετε καταλάβει, είναι διεθνής. Δεν κρυβόμαστε, δηλαδή στο ποιοι είμαστε. Θα πάρουμε λίγο τα πράγματα όμως από την αρχή, διότι η κατάσταση που επικρατεί στην Ελλάδα είναι τραγική εδώ και 10-15 χρόνια, με αποκορύφωμα βεβαίως την ιστορία των πολιτικών της μονόβλεψης λιτότητας που έφεραν στη χώρα οι Βρυξέλλες και οι κυβερνήσεις των Αθηνών και των προηγούμενων χρόνων. Δηλαδή, σας θυμίζω ότι η χώρα μου, η Ελλάδα, πριν από 10 χρόνια περίπου είχε Ολυμπιάδα, το 2004. Στην χώρα μου, θέλω να σας πω, πριν εκείνη την εποχή είχαμε το θαύμα του χρηματιστηρίου. Στη χώρα μου, εκείνη την εποχή ήταν οι μεγάλες ευκαιρίες για τις επενδύσεις. Στη χώρα μου, οι ίδιες πολιτικές δυνάμεις και οι ίδιοι συμμαχοί τους στις Βρυξέλλες έφεραν μια χώρα και πολίτες στην καταστροφή. Στην οικονομική καταστροφή, στο γονάτισμα. Θέλω να σας πω ακόμα και δύο λόγια, ότι στην κρίση αυτή, μέσα από αυτές τις συνθήκες, δημιουργήθηκε ένα νέος πολιτικός φορέας, ο ΣΥΡΙΖΑ, που σήμερα είναι στην κυβέρνηση. Αυτά είναι τα δεδομένα στο πολιτικό κομμάτι. Τα ξέρετε άλλωστε. Στο δεύτερο κομμάτι, που αφορά στα μέσα μαζικής ενημέρωσης, στη δική μου χώρα, όπως είπε πολύ σωστά ο συνάδελφος Κωνσταντίνου, έχουμε 5 οικογένειες οι οποίες έχουν τα μέσα παραγωγής, ό,τι παράγουν αυτά, το φυσικό πλούτο και βεβαίως τα μέσα ενημέρωσης και χειραγώγησης. Και κάποιες ο Γιώργος Αργυρόπουλος με μονομένες περιπτώσεις. Θέλω να σας πω, πως ίσως κάτι θα ξέρετε, ότι και εγώ ως παρουσιαστής της ΕΡΤ είχα την πρωινή εκπομπή, την τετράωρη μάλλον πρωινή εκπομπή στην ΕΡΤ, και κοπήκαμε στον αέρα επειδή μεταδώσαμε μια είδηση. Η είδηση ήταν ότι σύμφωνα με τις ανακοινώσει του εισαγγελέως, πολίτες είχαν βασανιστεί στη Γενική Αστυνομική Διεύθυνση Αθηνών. Ήταν η κυβέρνηση του κ. Σαμαρά και του σοσιαλδημοκράτη κ. Βενιζέλου.
Κώστα, Κώστα.
Του ΣΥΡΙΖΑ, του κ. Αλέξη Τσίπρα, ο οποίος είπε ότι έχουμε ένα
Άκουμε.
Το οποίο εκείνη την εποχή ήταν ένα ακτιβίστικο ραδιόφωνο, έντιμο και καθαρό. Μικρής εμβέλειας, με ένα πολύ μικρό πομπό στο λεκανοπέδιο της Αττικής. Μου είπε ότι έχουμε τη δυνατότητα, αν θέλουμε, να κάνουμε το όνειρό μας πράξη. Και το ξεκινήσαμε. Σήμερα το Κόκκινο είναι το τρίτο ενημερωτικό ραδιόφωνο στη χώρα. Το Κόκκινο είναι ένα δίκτυο ραδιοφωνικών. Για να δούμε λίγο.
Κώστα, πρέπει να έχουμε ένα τεχνικό πρόβλημα και...
Unfortunately, we're experiencing technical difficulties and the quality of the sound cannot be interpreted. We'll have to try to speak slower than that. We'll see what we can do to resolve the problem. Now, is it possible even technically to resolve the problem? I don't know. There was no interpretation in any event. Perhaps I can ask, is it possible to resolve this problem?
Μπορούμε να λύσουμε το πρόβλημα? Όχι.
Apparently no, we won't be able to fix it.
You have to turn it off. Right. So this sound has been tested already earlier, and we were facing the same challenge with interpreters that were already informing us that they were maybe not able to do anything with the interpretation in this sound condition.
We cannot have... okay. Okay. Κώστα, δεν υπάρχει, έχουμε ένα πρόβλημα και δεν μπορούμε να...
Well, we are experiencing this technical problem, so there will be no interpretation from what you say. Could I ask you to make your proposal and I'll try to translate it live?
Στα αγγλικά.
Αν θα θέλετε να σας κάνουμε την μετάφραση εμείς εδώ από την Αθήνα και θα κάνω πολύ πιο μικρή την τοποθέτησή μου.
Τίποτα. They sound Greek to them. It sounds Greek to them. So...
Κάνουμε μια προσπάθεια με εσάς.
Όχι, δεν μπορούμε να κάνουμε. Έχει αποτύχει το σχέδιο.
Unfortunately, it's not going to work. Unfortunately, we cannot interpret what you're saying.
Θέλω να μεταφέρεις απλώς δύο σκέψεις εσύ στους συνάδελφους. Για να μην πάει έτσι στράφη η όλη σκέψη.
He has a proposition. A couple of propositions. Go on. Sorry, we cannot go like this. Cezine Onay has the floor. Cezine Onay, and we'll try to fix the problem if we can. Cezine Onay, she's an academician and a journalist as well. She has worked for different publications, including Millet, a very well-known Turkish newspaper. Now she's working for the Haberdas. Haber is the news, right?
Yes.
Okay. which is an online news site. And different others you will tell us, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry that I have to take the floor now. I was very interested in hearing the presentation by Kostas. And actually, I'm going to base my speech specifically on the case of Internet in Turkey, because this is the only medium, actually, almost the only medium left for Turkish journalists to present their views, the independent ones, that is. And of course, Turkey is not this monolithic place that we usually think of it. I'm still astonished by its diversity. So it's really important to understand that also this repression that Turkey faces now in terms of freedoms and rights, it's a very complex process. President Erdogan is of course this big challenge to begin with, but it's really important to understand still Turkey's diversity. And it's a very mixed country, really. Is it a European one or the Middle Eastern one? I always question myself. Of course, all these categories are redundant in themselves as well. But also, you have the question whether it's really a modern country or not really. And I think to present the Internet landscape in Turkey in general is important to understand this mixed-up situation, actually. Because as far as its demographics are concerned, Turkey is very much mixed, as I mentioned. Religious-wise, you always hear that 90% of the Turkish population is Muslim, but within this box of this population, you have different, of course, you have the non-Muslims, and of course you have the Muslims who are very different in themselves. You have the atheists, you have the God-believing atheists, because according to a recent public opinion poll, a lot of Turkish atheists, although they are a minuscule population, believe in God at the same time. I don't know how that's possible, but our minds are mixed, I think, in Turkey as well. So never mind. But you have this population, which 80% of them live in the urban environments, modern urban environments now. Turkey has become really urbanized. But at the same time, you have this huge rural, in a way, underlying line as well, because you have this 80 million population, a quarter of them are employed in the agricultural sector. And you have this very young population. Turkey has one of the biggest youth populations. It's the biggest youth population actually in Europe. 16.6% of the country is aged between 15 and 24. Which the EU average is 11.5, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But Turkey is also projected to have an aging population in the next decade. So we share problems with Europe in that sense. And this is why President Erdogan advocates a pro-natalist policy, advocating that every couple should have 3 children at least. This diversity is also evident in the digital arena, in the sense that almost 40 million of the population is online. But those who are connected are mostly urban dwellers, and they tend to be really enthusiastic about digital technology. Urban Turkey, this connected part of Turkey, uses online news predominantly as a news source. Out of the urban population, 88%, which is a big number, uses online news sites as their prime source of information. And 67% or so uses the social media as a medium. These are numbers by a Reuters poll, a poll conducted for Reuters last year. The numbers are of 2015. And of course, we have this low trust in the media, traditional media, prevalent in Turkey. It's not as bad as Greece in that sense. 45 to 50% of the people believe that they cannot trust the traditional media. And in general, as in many other markets, Facebook happens to be the predominant social medium used by the people. And Turkey is one of the top countries in the world as far as Facebook usage is concerned. But Facebook is usually predominantly used for social networking purposes, not for sharing political information. So the politicized social media medium in Turkey is Twitter, of course. And Twitter is used by 17 to 18% of the population, which makes around 7 million people, more or less. And they are mostly, the Twitter users of Turkey are mostly, and not so surprisingly, from the urban centers of Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. So on the mobile side of the news, you have 70 million mobile subscriptions. So almost the whole country has a cellular phone. It's a big thing in Turkey, and people love to use their mobile phones. But only 30 to 35% of the mobile users do use smartphones. So there's less connection as far as cellular gadgets are concerned. And when people use smartphones, they usually use it for applications like WhatsApp. So it's not for news consumption, generally. So you have this country which uses internet a lot, but there's a complex relationship in the sense that news sites like mine, like Haberdar, do not have, they're followed up a lot. And as I mentioned, it's one of the prime, they are one of the prime sources of information. But at the same time, they rely mostly on columnists like me. And they usually have recycled news content, meaning that they borrow news, take news from each other, either, or they take news from the traditional media and, in a way, give a more critical edge to those stories. So it's impossible that such online sites that have very little resources in general to become really hubs of independent journalism and to, in a way, be examples like Ignacio mentioned. You don't have that in Turkey, unfortunately. And they barely cover their own costs, and they barely survive, basically. And on the other hand is government's own media, which I call personally genetically modified media, because they really look like any other media outlet, and their members pretend as if they're journalists, but in fact they're basically government's PR people. And they act and function as such. And they just use hate speech without any limits. So, and they also, there's huge yellow journalism going on. You just have news that are totally fabricated, that doesn't even have the kernel of truth inside. And they are used a lot for character assassinations, in a way, of politicians, of other journalists, you name it, basically anyone. But they have abundant resources. So, everything. 80% of the traditional media controlled by the government. I mean, it's not an exaggerated estimation, but also the in a way, the mainstream media, more not totally government linked, but in mainstream media is very much dominated by the government now. And you have this genetically modified journalists infiltrating and either as editors or columnists or reporters, you name it. You have that domination also in the mainstream traditional media. What survives as independent traditional media is just very limited. You might be talking of a coverage of, I don't know, 100,000 at most a day in total of newspapers. For a population of 80 million, it's nothing. Of course, we cannot say that the print media, or this new traditional print media, the genetically modified media, is very popular. They don't attract that much, in a way, wide readership. For example, just to give an example from this, Zaman, the most circulated daily of Turkey, which was seized some weeks ago. I'm sure you heard the news. And it had a circulation of around 1 million. And all of a sudden, circulation dropped down to thousands only, some 2,000-3,000, if I'm not mistaken, after it's seized by the government. Yes, this genetically modified media doesn't get to have its own, I don't know, fanatical readers or fanatical, in that sense, audience. It does to an extent, but not that much. But the power of the pro-government media lies in constant repetition. They are all around, so they dominate the rhetoric in the end, the public agenda, so to say. I gave the example of Zaman, the most circulated daily of Turkey that was seized. It was owned by this religious cleric, Gülen sect, and they are declared as a terrorist organization now. They were the allies of the government up to a certain point, but they afterwards become each other's arch enemies. But then who isn't a terror organization, a part of a terror organization, as a critic nowadays in Turkey is another question. Because now you have this armless terror crimes that are invented. And 4 academics from Turkey's foremost universities now face up to 8 years in prison for signing a petition of peace. This petition demanded that the government ceases military operations in southeast of Turkey, Kurdish-dominated parts of Turkey. And these operations have claimed up around 500 civilian lives so far, and 500 security officers' deaths. And the casualties of the armed insurgent group PKK are unknown. They are said to number around thousands. So you have this huge death toll of Turkish citizens mounting and Kurdish mounting. Signing a peace petition becomes a crime. This is actually frightening. I think frightening for all Europe. And Kurdish media and social media is heavily repressed. Accounts are blocked, journalists are detained, and they don't even get to be the news. In the total, out of the around 35 imprisoned journalists, most are Kurdish. And we don't even get to hear their names around, in a way, for advocacy. In such an jingoistic, very extremely nationalist by day atmosphere, of course anyone may be deemed as a supporter of terrorism. And President Erdogan, for example, recently called for stripping the citizenship of those who sympathize with terror. So that might lead to thousands of people from Turkey who are stripped of their nationalities, meaning thousands of new refugees from Turkey this time. So you might see me around as one. Joking aside, the slip of Turkey's media freedoms is very evident by international reports as well. Just to quote the report of Reporters Without Borders, Freedom Index, Turkey ranked 149th out of 180 countries in 2015. And when Justice and Development Party came to power, it was 99th. So now Greece is, I think, in our place, which wasn't a bad place. I'm lamenting for those days, unfortunately. Yes.
You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay. I'll be quick. I won't be crying anymore. Really, enough of lacrimose things. But just to give an example from the legal side of the issue, a controversial internet law was passed by the majority of AKP in 2014, and you can be now blocking entire sites, not just pages of the internet sites, by court order. And of course you have trouble that you have also accounts of social media users blocked, or their contents may be censored. And Twitter is unfortunately complying to those requests, and Turkey is the number one, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the top in censorship requests filed to Twitter. Facebook complies much more, but Twitter started to comply a lot as well. And every time there's a bombing in Turkey, which has been quite a lot in the last years, almost within minutes there's a media ban imposed. And every time it's in a faster way. And you have also social media access to Twitter and Facebook slowed down. So you have a complete blackout then. Because any kind of reporting is banned, actually. Of course, mainstream media and government-affiliated media do report. You cannot just be keeping silent, but they report in a very veiled way. So you know that there is an attack that has happened, but you don't know the details. And it's in this very dark and shady atmosphere, you cannot be just relying on the government's declarations about who did the attack, how it happened, etc. And people try to, of course, use the social media as a medium, but they have their access denied. So what happens is that we became experts on VPNs, virtual private networks, and we try to circumvent in that way. But, of course, not everyone can use them. And so, in general, there are many other examples that I can give you, and we share the same problems as in Greece and as in Spain, as in Italy, but we have, on top of this really big repression. And I can testify that for the first time I'm feeling really imprisoned. Although I'm not inside a prison in Turkey, it's like you're in a virtual prison all the time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Now we're going to listen to the proposition of Kostas. Whether we found a solution. Well, I'm calling him. I'll repeat in Greek what he says, and then the translators, the interpreters will. Κώστα, ναι, ωραία. Λοιπόν, σε ακούω, θα επαναλαμβάνω εγώ αυτά που λες.
I'll repeat what you're saying, all right? I'd like to hear your proposal now, please.
Έχουμε σήμερα τη δυνατότητα να μην είμαστε άλοθοι ουσιαστικά.
Έχουμε τη δυνατότητα να κάνουμε... ναι.
Να κάνουμε το διαφορετικό.
Να κάνουμε το διαφορετικό.
Αυτό που υπάρχει λοιπόν σήμερα και από τις τοποθετήσεις που άκουσα είναι ότι το πρόβλημα δεν είναι αν θα βγει ή δεν θα βγει μια είδηση, αλλά είναι πώς θα βγει. Το θέμα λοιπόν είναι η πηγή. Και νομίζω ότι οι συνθήκες είναι όριμες πια για να δημιουργηθεί το πρακτορείο της αριστερής οπτικής.
Ωραία. Το πρόβλημα λοιπόν από ό,τι άκουσε είναι η πηγή.
Based on what I've understood, you're talking about the specific information if you want a special news agency for left-wing news. Not left information, but a leftist view of the news.
Παραδείγματος χάρη στο πρόσφατο χτύπημα στην Άγκυρα που είχαν οι Τούρκοι.
For example, when it comes to the terrorist attacks in Turkey or in Brussels for that matter. The fact is that the media and the news agencies are always saying the same thing. It's the same message between them. When it comes to difficult information, and sometimes not even so difficult information, either there's no news or just minor details. It's as if one person's writing and everybody else just spreads the message. And when it comes to our radio station, Sto Kokino, we have the expertise, the professionalism, and the daily news, the topical events is a very powerful tool, a very powerful weapon. Actually, there should be no left-wing or right-wing public. What's important is that we're able to speak the truth, to report on the truth. We can't leave all the information up to the capitalists. So that's the proposal. And with GUI's assistance, maybe we could act on that. But now, when it comes to the cooperation with other broadcasters, Sto Kokino in Greece, perhaps working with other news broadcasters or other agencies, they could be part of that as well. In principle, all of this could then develop in the various countries. We could create a sort of corporation or cooperative form of doing business where journalists could come together and work together. The reason why Sto Kokino was so successful was because they, of course, did not get any outside influence when it came to the news. Well, thank you very much. In a nutshell, that's my proposal.
Gentlemen, you have the floor. You can ask questions or interventions or whatever you want. And the previous speaker, as well as Julian Assange via Skype, is available for answering your questions. I must inform you that recently, this week actually, WikiLeaks rocked again the political situation in Greece by publishing some documents leaked. There was a conversation between the different IMF responsibles in the European one and the one for Greece, and they are discussing between them. And what it was found that it was that they were contemplating, they were thinking of again organizing a kind of like the previous summer, blackmailing Greece to sign again the Greek government to sign again more tough austerity measures, more hard than those agreed last summer. This was published, and it had made a lot of it rocked again the political landscape in Greece, with some political parties speaking in favor of IMF, unfortunately, but this is another story. So Julian is again with us, and you can ask him as well as the other speakers about the. So, who wants to ask a question? Please.
Hello, my name is David Lundy. I work for Corporate Europe Observatory. Just to come back on the points from earlier on about the crisis of journalism and the points raised by Julian about freedom of expression and access to information. It was interesting to hear the possibility that the EU might, I think you said, take up the slack on the lack of protection for freedom of expression at the member state level. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that's going to be the case, and recent evidence will point in the opposite direction, that the EU is actually leading an attack on freedom of expression, and it's a lot more urgent than I think a lot of people are aware of. The Trade Secrets Directive is set to be voted on next Thursday in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. This is a Commission proposal that would give excessive rights to companies to protect what they themselves define as a trade secret. It runs completely counter to international standards on the right to access information and makes secrecy the norm rather than the exception. So this attack on journalists in particular and whistleblowers would make, for instance, those people publishing the details of the Panama Papers scandal in the last few days, they'd make them liable to prosecution, and it makes it harder for leaks, mass leaks in general. So I'd just like to raise that point because it's just a week away. The vote is next Thursday in Strasbourg. The debate is on Wednesday evening. And it would be great if MEPs could really mobilise behind the trade unions, NGOs, and the Green Group in the European Parliament as well has been pushing hard on this. And the other question I want to raise was also on access to information. Especially here in Brussels, the major power centre of the European Union, where we actually have very little investigative journalism going on. And I'm not sure if I caught Costas's point correctly, or if I understood it correctly, but I think it would be great if the Left Group in the Parliament could support efforts to bring journalists to Brussels and learn the basic tools of how you do investigative journalism in Brussels, how you do an access to document request to the European Commission, for instance, how you investigate the permanent representations, because that's something that obviously the Commission is not keen to publicise.
Thank you very much. Does any deputy wants to comment on this, or Julian maybe?
I will comment if you...
yes, because it was not a question, actually. It was rather a comment. But if you want to,
Yes, in relation to trade secrets, there's a long history coming from the United States in abusing trade secret law to stifle the press and to increase the costs of publishing. Whenever we talk about laws that intersect with people who publish, and of course now, because of social media and WordPress, that includes everyone. What we're really talking about is not whether you can win litigation in the end, when you get all the way up to the European Courts of Justice. The question is, how much can a cashed up oligarch or company tax people who engage in publishing material about it by abusing the process, grabbing onto hooks like trade secret law to force publishers and internet service providers and individuals into very expensive litigation. And the experience from the United States has been a disastrous one, that trade secrets law is used to create taxes on publishers who publish quotes, say, from internal emails, like we've seen a few with the Pentagon Papers, with the Panama Papers. Now, the situation, however, is already very bad here in Europe. One of our partner publications, Deutsche Zeitung in Germany, SZ, who was the principal, who got hold of the Panama Papers, who developed that source, how many did they publish? How many Panama Papers did they publish? The principal media organization involved, 0. They have published 0. They have published an occasional quote, but they have released 0 Panama Papers. So why is that? Because of fears of litigation risk. Already we are at this stage where a fairly strong mainstream press organization in Germany that is willing at least to take on some of the stories coming from the material feels it's not in a position to be able to publish a single document.
Okay. Can I ask you a question? Because of the activity of WikiLeaks, you are blocked already 4 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. I think it's 4 years, yes, more or less.
Yes, coming up to 4 years.
Is it worth the price?
Well, if you believe in something, you have to pay a price. That's if you believe in something if you believe in something universal, such as that our political systems can only be as good as the knowledge that people have about how the world actually works, then you might have to pay quite a high price. But important things are worth paying a price for. If we talk about the situation here in the UK, I have been detained without charge in the United Kingdom for nearly 6 years. My passport has been seized by the United Kingdom. I've never been charged in any country for any offence. And as you've seen just recently, the United Nations has found that the whole thing is illegal.
There is a question for Beatriz Rayos. You can always ask questions through the Twitter, hashtag alternative media. There is a question, I'm taking one question from the Twitter, via Twitter. Chiara Piotto asks Assange if in the era of whistleblower there is still, and leaks and WikiLeaks, there is still the need of a mediation of journalists, and what's the role of investigative journalism?
I have worked with some very fine investigative journalists over 20 years. In our publications, we have pulled together 100 media organizations across the world, more than 110 media organizations, some very fine journalists in those organizations. But generally speaking, let's be clear here, the role of journalists is to execute political agendas by proxy. That is the primary role of journalists. There's secondary factors, such as that they are part of a particular culture, they are part of a particular class, and while not necessarily wittingly executing that agenda, they simply know no better because they're so immersed in the provincial concerns of their class and culture.
More questions, please. Yes, you, and then yes, please.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Álvaro Lear, soy investigador en la ULB en comunicación y tengo una pregunta.
I'm a researcher in communication, and I have a question for Ignacio. We're seeing how several countries who share problems, Greece, Italy, Spain, etc., and that's a problem. I mean, do you see any kind of transnational cooperation to deal with the problems that these countries face? And if you do envisage such a thing, how could that take place? Well, I think the problems that we face in Spain and Italy are very different from those described by our colleague in Turkey. I mean, they're terrible problems, but they're different. But we do need to cooperate, I think. I mean, I think one of the best ways in which we could help each other would be talking about the media in the media. We don't normally do that. Basically because in Spain there's a kind of maximum that states the press doesn't criticize the press. And I think if you really talk about what's going on in Turkey, you have to criticize some of the media in Turkey as well, not only the government. We are working internationally. We have an agreement, for example, with The Guardian to share international information with them. They provide us international information, which we then translate into Spanish and offer our readers. And in Spain, we're working with other media groups to create safe places where we can work with other groups and where we can receive information safely. We've received confidential information, for example, on negotiations on TTIP there, and there we are sharing information, resources, and also a secure post box where we can receive information. But I do think we need to get together to denounce abuses that are taking place, particularly when they're as clear as those that are taking place in Turkey or in Bulgaria as well, as another case.
Ο συνάδελφος, θα δώσω το λόγο σε εσάς πριν έχει ζητήσει ο...
I'm going to give you the floor, but I'm going to begin by giving the floor to the GUI member Taki Giorgio. We don't have a great deal of time. I will struggle to get my question in, I think, in a brief moment of time, but I'll try to. Well, when we talk about press freedom, we don't mean the same thing as what governments mean when they say the same thing. I mean, often governments claim to support press freedom, but what they're actually doing is supporting the owners of media groups. What we mean is something entirely different. Currently, this so-called press freedom has actually led journalists to exercise their jobs in a way that, to a certain extent, competes against the corruption of media owners. I mean, your mainstream gutter press is pushing journalists to adopt those kinds of practices. And I think that the only solution really would be for journalists to resist the trend by founding their own media groups, I think. Otherwise, we find ourselves in the current situation pursuant to which we basically hear journalists with the same point of view on all media forms. They're basically being forced to express the same point of view. But I don't really see how all journalists can be gathered up to make an effort against that. Thank you for the question. There's another question.
Pablo García from El Diario here in Brussels. It's a follow-up on the last question about your situation, if I may, because according to the Spanish former Chut and now Lauer, Baltasar Garzón, you may likely be released soon. That's the words that he used very recently, a few days ago. I don't know if you can tell us more details about that, but it would be great. Thanks.
Julian?
I don't want to get into my situation too much. I'll just tell you the next important event that is to occur. The United Nations is to review the United Kingdom's appeal in relation to its decision and to see whether it is admissible in the next 2 weeks. So that's the next big point. There's a number of legal cases going on. There's a legal case, a criminal case in the United States in relation to our publishing. There's one in Sweden to dismiss an arrest warrant. There's one in Egypt. There's one in Saudi in relation to publications. There's one in Australia in relation to publications, etc. But we'll see. I mean, the situation, like many of these situations, is ultimately political. And when big politics is involved, unfortunately, the law is swept aside, and the law is no longer obeyed because of the political imperatives. And that's why it's necessary to have relief valves face by being overridden by the European Court or by another country's asylum process, etc. I want to speak very seriously. I want to take a look at a concrete example of this. I think a very serious example involving the Kurdish people, Turkey, Obama, Scandinavia, and the separation of powers. So ROJ-TV was largest Kurdish language broadcaster. Now, of course, it cannot operate safely in Turkey or even safely in Kurdistan, in the other Kurdish broadly speaking, the Kurdish regions of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. So it operated out of Denmark. And now Turkey said, in response to the United States wanting Rasmussen to become the head of NATO, the former Danish PM, that they would veto the Danish PM becoming head of NATO unless unless Denmark destroyed ROJ-TV, which was beaming up to Eurosat from Denmark. Now, twice the Danish courts looked into ROJ-TV and they found that it was not violating any law, that it was just like a normal news channel, except it broadcast in Kurdish. It was not promoting terrorism. It did not have links to the PKK, and so on. However, the Danish intelligence agency, PET, and the Danish prosecution authority went into the US embassy and stitched up a deal, signed off by Obama, as is documented in these two cables, to screw ROJ-TV to completely destroy the largest Kurdish language broadcaster in the world, to destroy the dominant TV station for a whole language, to marginalize the Kurdish people. And that was bought into by the former Prime Minister of Denmark, Rasmussen. It was bought into by NATO. It was bought into by Obama. It was bought into by Turkey. It was bought into by the Danish prosecutorial system and by Danish intelligence, and it was done. It was done, and ROJ-TV lost its license. Is appealing at the European Court of Human Rights, and these documents are the star exhibit. Now, I did not find these documents and publish a story about it. These came out because we understand the importance of historical archives, the importance of history circa now. These archives, once opened up, are also opened up to Kurdish broadcasters facing censorship, which we certainly weren't thinking about as publishers. And that is the WikiLeaks model, to maximize the press attention through limited period of exclusives, but then to open up the whole archive to the public. Now, the current level of fear about publication, as I said before, meant that SC, the leading publisher behind the Panama Papers, hasn't published a single document. So revelations like this are not going to happen because of the fear of publishing archives. Similarly, these archives were used to find successfully in the European Court of Human Rights that El Masri, the German citizen, had been kidnapped by the CIA. And in fact, in many hundreds of other court cases and tens of thousands of academic papers. So why should this new medium that we have be limited in its form to the old practices of being constrained by the amount of words you can fit into a piece of newsprint? The value of revelations like this is in the historical archive. Just like the Stasi files, their value is as an archive. And the world is generating archives now, not 50 years in the past, but now. And if we can get them out now, then we can have the sort of impact that's needed at scale. The big problems need to be dealt with at scale. And the entire economy of the media in Europe is actually not big enough to deal with complex problems at scale. Everyone needs to be, almost everyone needs to be involved in that in some way, with their own small interactions with one small industry or another, or individuals looking to see should their sister marry some man. That is how you really create transparency. WikiLeaks enforces it through its publishing model. However, the EU also needs to enforce it in relation to disclosure of documents, like the TTIP, like its internal practices and correspondences.
Okay, thank you, Julian. Other questions, please? Yes?
Hello, my name is Merve Güngör. I'm very pessimistic about the current situation of mainstream media in Turkey, so I'd like to, I don't want to comment about that, but I would like to ask another question instead to any panelists who are interested in replying. In the previous session, Mr. Curzio Maltese mentioned the importance of young people, and we at the Economic and Social Committee organize this youth event every year. It's called Your Europe, Your Say, and we invite students from all over Europe, and this year we also invited students from the 5 applicant countries as well. And each year they draw up their own proposals. And this year, interestingly, but maybe not interestingly, the proposal which got the highest votes was about media. Students wanted a media reform, and the way they thought to achieve this was like they asked for stronger regulations about guidelines for reporting news, especially about migration and refugees. And I'd like to ask you, how do you think we can overcome the challenges in terms of reporting news about these sensitive issues, given that currently media does a lot of misinformation, misrepresentation? And yes, what do you think about this? Thank you.
Okay. Before I'm given you want to answer, Curzio? Before answering, we have to say goodbye to our special guest, Julian Assange. Julian, thank you very much for being with us for such a long time. We hope the best for you, that your odyssey will finish soon, and you will be again free and kicking, working for the good information. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Okay, Curzio, the answer to the...
No, sono molto in breve. Non è solo una questione.
Very briefly, it isn't just a question of conditions. It's not just a question of salary and what kind of contract you have. It's a question of legal protection. At the last time I was in court, I was taken to court, or rather the last time there was a case against a major company that was looking for $10 million damages, I was still being protected by my editor. But a young journalist nowadays who's writing about major companies, multinationals, at the moment, it isn't just a question of needing courage. I mean, if I were to run the risk of ending up in prison every time or having to pay $10 million damages, which obviously I haven't got, then I would have been a much less brave journalist. It's a question of labor, of working conditions. Nobody should be required to be a hero in order to do a job.
Άλλη ερώτηση, παρακαλώ.
Any other questions?
Some more questions. If you, there are some coming from the Twitter. Yes, please.
Yes, hello. Buenas tardes. Alberto Fernández.
Hello. Fernandez from the 6th television program here in Brussels. We're talking about the conditions journalists work under. I'd like to ask Mr. Escolar whether at a time when the social networks have introduced a quantity of information at a speed that we're not used to, and there's a lack of resources for media and for journalists. Given all that and looking towards the future, does he think that you can say that the quality of information and the quality of journalism, investigative journalism specifically, is guaranteed? No, of course, the quality of information has gone down as resources for media journalists have gone down. With less media, the journalism gets worse. There's no question of that. I'm worried about the trend, above all, because in the relationship between internet and the printed press, sometimes we think it's like dinosaurs. They die and then you get mammals and there's a happy end. Some die, some are born, and the system is still there. What I'm worried about is that the dinosaurs, the big written press groups, are dying, and the new ones coming in are not filling the space that they leave behind them. So are we going to be able to stand up to a $10 million damages claim without collapsing? Are we going to be able to pay for a journalist working 3-4 months on a single subject, doing an investigation? The major communication media used to be able to do that, but the survival of that kind of work is in question. The good thing about the present situation, I don't want to talk only about the bad news, is that the worst moment for the press as a counterpower is the best moment for freedom of expression. And why do I say that? Is the fact that there are now so many media in Spain, because the access barrier, the economic access barrier, has gone right down, and the proof is that a set of journalists with their own savings were able to set up our page, and the whole series of other startups of the same kind in other countries. So the entry barrier is lower, and that makes it much more difficult to keep something quiet. To give you a very specific example, when Aznar, the Spanish Prime Minister, decided that the attack on the 11th of March must have been done by ETA, he rang up all the editors and told them that that was what it was, and then they all published it the next day. But the first version, the next day, of the March 2002 attacks in Spain was set up as being announced by the Basques because of 10 telephone calls from the Prime Minister. But you couldn't do that today. You'd have to spend the whole morning ringing up all the different media, all the different blogs, and then another morning for the blogs, and then another morning for the television and radio stations, and still somebody would say, "You're lying, Prime Minister." So that has changed. The worst time for the press is possibly the best time for freedom of expression. You can't hush something up anymore. But there's an enormous amount of work being done to pursue the news and to be a platform for freedom of expression with a plurality of voices. And that, of course, requires a sufficient amount of resources to pick up the stories that are worth publishing, to keep somebody awake at night.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. We only have 5 minutes more because of the interpretation. Is there any other question from you guys? There are some questions from the internet, from the Twitter. One of the questions, if somebody wants to ask, is if there is something, if there is a leak without knowing the source of the leak, is this probably some hidden interests behind it? So what's how we can judge whether a leak is a good one, as an honest with some
Nunca lo sabe.
You never really know if it's an interested leak or not. Almost all leaks usually are. But your job as a journalist is to find out if it's true or not, and not to look into the motives of the source for leaking it in the first place.
Okay. Λοιπόν, we have to finish now. Thank you very much all for your participation. It was a very good step. It's due to the idea Curcio Maltese had for organizing all the whole event here. We're gonna continue. Shall we organize another one? You think next year?
I think there are a lot of things to do here, and a lot of things to discuss about. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the interpreters as well. They did as well a good job. Thank you to everybody. Goodbye.